some important, some emerging things that I want to talk about. But let's get started. All right, so when we're talking about wildlife and wildlife management, we're talking about free-ranging, non-domesticated vertebrates. So vertebrate, something with a backbone. Winston's not around anymore, but Winston right here, he is not wildlife or was not wildlife. And for the purpose of this talk, we're not going to talk about fish, reptiles and amphibians. I have seen videos of gators eating melons, but that's pretty few and far between. So we really are going to focus on mammals and birds. But as far as wildlife damage, so wildlife damage is, just to put it simply, when people and wildlife start butting heads, they come into conflict. And another way to look at it is when wildlife has some sort of effect on someone's quality of life. Many of y'all being producers, it's when they're damaging your crops. To get a little bit more technical, wildlife damage is the science, because we do use science-based information based off of the biology of the species, what has worked effectively in the past through scientific studies as far as mitigation and damage reduction, but also in art. When we're getting into mammals and birds, many of y'all have probably had dogs. Dogs are individuals. The coyotes, the raccoons, they're individuals too. So what's going to work for one isn't necessarily going to work for the other. So it's the science and the art of diminishing the negative consequences, in this case, crop damage, of wildlife while maintaining or enhancing their positive aspects. Now, as long as it's not an invasive species, wildlife should be around. And it does have value. Most of it is very important for the health of our ecosystem. So we want to increase those positive aspects while decreasing the negative. Okay, so wildlife, it's a resource. And like I said, it can have both a positive and a negative value. And values don't exist without people. So they're based on beliefs. Beliefs are created by attitudes. So a belief, Chip and I were just talking about gators before this kicked off, but belief alligators are dangerous. My attitude may be different from yours. I mean, I like being around gators. A lot of people don't. But again, if there's no people, then there's no values at all. So what we want to do is have that net positive value. All right, but as far as identifying wildlife damage, that is the most important first step. Because you may get lucky and see what it is that's causing damage to your crops, but without actually seeing the animal in the act, it can be difficult. So a lot of wildlife is nocturnal. You're going to go to bed at night, wake up the next morning and see a whole bunch of damage, and may not know what exactly caused it. And wildlife, it varies by species, but many do want to avoid interactions with people. They view us as dangerous. So some ways to identify that pest species or the species that caused the damage. Game cameras are fantastic if you got access to them. A little less high tech. And I don't know if game cameras are high tech anymore, but a little less high tech is just to get a spotlight out at night. Oftentimes whatever is causing damage will return multiple nights in a row. So if you view damage one day, going out the next night, you might catch it in the act. Wildlife tracks. Wildlife can be very readily identified by the tracks they leave. And then finally, what the damage to the plants actually looks like. For example, rabbits and deer, they're both going after a lot of the same things, but the damage that they cause is going to look different. So as mentioned, it can be difficult to identify what the pest is, but you really need to, because the solution for rabbit damage is a lot different than deer. That fence, if that's the option that you choose to go with, and that is often a good route to take, that fence is going to need to be significantly higher if deer are involved. And then decide on action. So how much damage warrants action? And that is going to be completely up to you. What is unacceptable to one producer may be acceptable to the other. The one person might not just care enough about it, or they just don't have the time to put these mitigation or management strategies in place. So decide on what your threshold is, how much damage needs to occur before you do something about it. As far as management strategies, I just want to put it out there right away. There is no magic powder. Mothballs do not work. Mothballs, as the name implies, are for moths. And it's actually illegal to spread them around. So don't be putting mothballs out anywhere. This is probably more geared towards homeowners and backyard wildlife because everybody likes to put mothballs or gasoline places, and neither is a great idea. And again, there is no silver bullet. So we're going to talk about this species by species, and again, it really is going to be case by case because a lot of these animals, they do have personalities, and that one individual might act differently from the other. So we'll talk about all the different techniques that are available. But when we talk about management strategies, they fall into two categories. One is non-lethal, so we are not killing the animal. This talk could be very short if I just told you to shoot everything. And in many cases, you can shoot a lot of things, but not everything. And some of those things you need to shoot during certain times a year or have a permit to do so. But with non-lethal, falls into a few categories. Habitat modification, that is taking away what is drawing the wildlife in. In this case, because oftentimes what is drawing them in is the crops you've planted. We're not really going to discuss that too much. Exclusion. So exclusion would very simply include things like fences or other barriers that prevent the wildlife from getting at the resource. Frightening devices. This is something that works on the concept of neophobia or fear of new things. And frightening devices, they can be visual, they can be auditory, but they work to varying degrees, and it's going to depend again on the species. Repellents. So repellents can be either taste or odor. So they smell bad or they taste bad, or in a lot of cases, they have hot pepper in them or capsaicin. So that's what's keeping the animals away. And then non-lethal trapping. But we will talk a little bit more about the legality of non-lethal trapping, because not just anybody can trap an animal and move it somewhere else. Oftentimes you need a permit for that. As far as lethal, so shooting is obviously one. Lethal trapping, toxicants. We don't have a whole lot of toxicant options here in Alabama. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to pigs. This is more geared towards backyard wildlife, but sprinklers, motion activated sprinklers, if you are working at a smaller scale where this may be feasible, motion activated sprinklers are a great way to scare wildlife away. All right. I am very much in favor of do-it-yourself solutions, but also it's important to know that resources are out there if your wildlife problems get to be too much that you can't deal with them yourself. ADCNR, or our state wildlife agency, they have a list of nuisance animal control operators. It's broken down by statewide operators and by county. So that's a good resource. Sometimes wildlife services will get involved. So wildlife services, they are part of USDA APHIS, and they deal with a lot of times agricultural issues or human safety issues related to wildlife. So you can give them a call as well. But really for them, the issue needs to rise towards the top of their list before they can come out and deal with it. Whereas with these nuisance animal control operators, you are paying them. So, as long as they're not too busy, they're going to come on out and do the job and get paid. All right. I mentioned that we're going to talk about the law some, and I really do think it's important. I do teach a course here at Auburn called Wildlife Conservation History and Law. So maybe I am biased some, but to be good stewards of the environment, we need to understand the law. So wildlife. So all the birds, all the mammals, all the reptiles and amphibians that we're not going to talk about that are in the state are classified as either a game species or a non-game species. So here's the list of all game animals. And this is doesn't include birds. So this is really all game mammals, but we got the alligator thrown in there as well. You'll notice some don't have a hunting season. So you can't legally hunt bear in Alabama. You can't legally hunt mountain lions, partially because they're not around. If you want to talk about that, we can talk about that later. Red wolves, which don't exist in Alabama anymore. But then everything else is a non-game animal. So all game animals are technically protected because, and this is just because they're regulated by laws. So all game animals will have a hunting season. Sometimes there is no closed season on a particular species, like wild pigs, no closed season on them. But others that may be pests, rabbits, deer, they do have a defined season when you can hunt them. And are some exceptions in place, which I'll talk about. But then we've also got non-game animals. There are some that are protected. Most of them are not, but there are some that are protected because either they are protected under the Endangered Species Act, so they're federally protected, or they're just high conservation concern in the state. So they are protected just by the state, not by the federal government. And we'll talk more about birds later, but birds are the most highly protected and regulated group of wildlife that there is. But just to get a little bit more into nuisance wildlife regulation, so even if the season is closed on a particular species, a property owner is allowed to take one squirrel, rabbit, raccoon, opossum, beaver, or skunk per incident that's causing damage. You don't need a permit. It can be out of season. It can really be however you're going to do that. But for deer, for example, you'll see that deer aren't included in that list. So if there was damage outside of the hunting season and shooting was one of the ways you wanted to deal with that issue, you would need to get a permit from the state to be able to do so. All right, so not everybody is wanting to shoot everything. That's probably a good thing. But the relocation or translocation of wildlife, because I get so many calls. It's like there's a bobcat around, there's a coyote around, there's a fox around, or even a raccoon. And people call me and they're like, "Well, can I just trap it and move it somewhere else, or more likely, can I come trap it and move it somewhere?" And technically, the answer is no. You need to have a permit to possess those live animals. Now, if I wanted to trap the raccoon and kill it, that would be perfectly legal. But as soon as I trap it and that raccoon, that live raccoon, gets in my truck, I'm in violation of the law. So just keep that in mind when you're dealing with your nuisance wildlife issues. Just staying on the right side of the law. And a big part of that is, if we're in possession of these live game animals, some things like raccoons, they can spread rabies, so there's a human health concern. But we've got all kinds of wildlife diseases. We don't need an unregulated movement of these critters all around the state because they could potentially spread diseases elsewhere. So these are the species or the groups of animals that I wanted to talk about today. Like I said, it is not all inclusive. If you've got questions about other species, I'm happy to chat further. Just give me a call or shoot me an email. Well, let's start off with rabbits. So rabbits, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are actually 4 different species in the state of Alabama. Got the eastern cottontail, pictured here, which is the most common. We've got the Appalachian cottontail. That is not common at all. You're only going to see that potentially in far northeast Alabama. I was checking. So if any of y'all are familiar with iNaturalist, it's a very cool website where you can document biodiversity. I checked on the Appalachian cottontail for records in Alabama prior to this talk, and there's not a single one. So very rare. The swamp rabbit, a little bit bigger than the eastern cottontail, but common in suitable habitat. And then the marsh rabbit. So eastern cottontail and the swamp rabbit, those are game species. You can hunt them during their hunting seasons, and also because they're rabbits, you can also remove individuals outside of the hunting season, provided that they're causing damage. The Appalachian cottontail, as I mentioned, very rare, and it is protected by the state. Also, the marsh rabbit. If you, and this is only going to be for folks who live down in Baldwin or Mobile counties, really, around the Delta. But if you're having problems with a rabbit and you're gonna about ready to shoot the rabbit, you look at it and it's got these tiny little ears. Don't do that because it's a marsh rabbit and they are protected by the state. In that case, reach out to the state for some guidance there. And they're probably going to tell you put up a fence because they are protected. All right, so again, identifying what sort of damage is happening, or not what sort, but what's causing it is important. And rabbit and deer, they go after a lot of the same things, but there's some pretty surefire ways to tell what's causing the damage. So rabbits, they aren't rodents; they're in their own group called lagomorphs, but they still got those big incisors, and they constantly need to chew. So bites from a rabbit or cuts from a rabbit are going to be at these 45-degree angles. They're going to be sharp cuts. With deer, deer are just grabbing a hold and tearing away what they're trying to eat. So it's going to have a ragged edge. Another way to tell is rabbit scat is round, deer scat is more oval or like a teardrop shape. As far as control methods for rabbits. So this might not be practical. So habitat modification, it could be your crops themselves that are drawing them in. If you can remove brush or stone piles, because everything likes to eat rabbits, they need somewhere where they can escape to. If they don't have those areas to escape to, it's going to be much fewer rabbits there. But fencing works well for rabbits. It doesn't need to be particularly high. About 2 feet tall. Rabbits can dig, so it should be about a foot deep. And some other things. So repellents, I'll talk more about this with deer, but there are those taste or odor repellents. Non-lethal trapping is possible, but again, being a game species, you can't move it yourself legally without a permit. So the route that most folks are going to take here with rabbits is going to be either fencing and use these recommendations for the best results, at least 2 foot or about 2 foot high, or shooting. That is one of the quickest ways to take care of this issue. So rabbits do have a hunting season. You need to check every year. So if you're not an avid hunter, you might not realize that the exact dates are going to change every year, but generally sometime in September through early March. And legally, you're allowed to shoot up to 8 a day. And it is worth mentioning that in Alabama, and this isn't the case in every state, but in Alabama, on your own property, you and your immediate family does not need a hunting license. You still need to abide by the number that you can take legally, but you don't need a hunting license even. But you can take up to 8 a day. But again, being rabbits, you can take them throughout the year, legally 1 a day, provided they're causing damage. All right, let's talk about the most dangerous wildlife species we've got in all of the country. So pretty much everybody is familiar with white-tailed deer, very, very, very popular game species, but they also cause a ton of problems. The reason they are the most dangerous is because of deer vehicle collisions. They kill more people than any other wildlife species every year solely for that reason. But damage to crops is an issue as well. As far as habitat modification, the crops again are what's drawing them in, so that's probably not going to work. Even my backyard garden, I'm still in the process of putting up a deer fence because I can't grow a thing without them coming in. And I live in the city limits, so I can't shoot them either. So that's another important note. We've got state laws, but also, especially if you are using a firearm to deal with your wildlife issue, make sure that it's legal to discharge it in the municipality where you're located, given that this is largely going to be rural or ag land. That shouldn't be an issue, but it's worth checking. But as far as lethal techniques, so shooting, so antler deer or bucks, You can harvest one a day and three per season. Unantlered though, so does and I mean really just any deer that doesn't have antlers, it is one per day. Uh, you know, hunters will hate to hear this, but we have too many deer across a lot of Alabama, across a lot of the United States. There's more deer now than there ever has been. So they cause issues like crop damage. But the season, sometime in October through sometime in February, that's going to be dependent on the year. But if deer are causing agricultural damage outside of that season, you can get a permit. You're going to have to contact the state. So wildlife and freshwater fisheries within ADCNR, but they can issue a permit for take outside of that season. So as far as deer repellents, and again, these are largely going to work on if you're operating at a pretty small scale. But again, there are taste and odor repellents. Usually taste, the active ingredient is capsaicin, which is what makes peppers hot. And then the smell, oftentimes you'll see listed on this slide, putrescent egg solids. So essentially rotten eggs. So a lot of times, many of these deterrents will mix the two, so it'll smell bad and it'll taste bad. It works to a degree. The thing about repellents in general, oh, I don't know why that skipped forward. Thing about repellents in general, um, they are only going to work to the degree that the deer is not very, very hungry. Because if a deer is very hungry, it is going to eat what you've got, regardless of what is on it. And that's an issue that I've had in my own backyard. But another thing with repellents, they do get washed off with the rain, so they need to be reapplied. So this is more on a different small scale. If you've got more than an acre or two, probably not going to want to use repellents. If you're not going a lethal route, though, deer fencing is the way to go. Um, Deer can jump very, very high. If you've never seen a deer jump very high, you might not expect it, but the guidance is, unless it's an electric fence, that fence should be at least 7 foot high. There are a few different materials, so probably polypropylene, could be high tensile, could be welded wire, could be a hexagrid, excuse me, could be hexagrid. So lots of options there. Really, the main thing is making sure that they are at least 7 foot high, unless it's electric. So electric fences don't need to be that high. And one of the reasons for this, so a deer could still jump it, but the fence itself is going to be a deterrent. The deer won't want to get close to it. And you can increase the chance that that happens. And this might seem a little cruel, but the deer is fine. I've gotten shocked by enough electric fences that I know it's not going to kill you. But to increase the efficacy of your deer fence, or your electric fence for deer, you can take some tinfoil, can put some peanut butter in between it, and then affix it to the wire. This will cause the deer to be attracted to it. They'll go over, they'll get a shock. Hopefully, they won't want to stick around after that. But again, either a non-electrified 7 foot high fence or an electrified fence, and you can increase your odds of success by getting the deer, or by encouraging the deer to shock themselves so they know that they shouldn't be nearby. All right, wild pigs. So the two species we discussed so far, they are native. They are supposed to be here. Wild pigs are not. They've got a long history in the South. They've been around since the Spanish conquistadors came through in the early 1500s, but they are not from here. They've been around long enough that many people think they are, but they're native to Europe and Asia, but they cause a ton of damage. Just in agricultural damage, it's estimated that across the country, over $1.5 billion a year. And there are issues elsewhere. So they're a huge issue in Australia, but they've really expanded in the past few decades. So looking back into the early 80s, a little over 40 years ago, you can see, they've already covered up all of Florida, but only about a third of Alabama. Um, you can see by the fact that they're in Kentucky and in the mountains of West Virginia as well, that they could be throughout Alabama. Because oftentimes what limits wildlife is because it gets too hot or too cold. It's just that they hadn't made their way around yet. And one of the best ways that they've made their way around is because some people really like hunting hogs and they move them around. So human mediated dispersal, or in simpler terms, humans throwing them in a trailer and moving them somewhere else so they can hunt them is one of the best ways they've gotten around. But they can move around themselves as well. So today, this is what it looks like. Not saying that every county in the state is going to have a hog problem. Generally, the further south you go, the more hog issues you run into. But I know in West Alabama, not terribly far south, hogs are a big issue. So conceivably, you could come across this issue in every county. As far as as an aside, so I did my PhD down in Florida. I've trapped hundreds of hogs at this point, so um, very very familiar with this species. As far as crop damage, though, so they'll directly target the crops. They also root, which is using their snout to dig down into the soil to uncover whatever is under there. In Florida, we found that they eat a ton of earthworms, so that contributes. They're big animals, so they could just trample the crops, and then wallowing. So to cool down, they'll create these muddy depressions that they'll roll around in. All those things can damage a crop field. So this pig is not buried, and I didn't do this to the pig. I was hiking along the Florida Trail in Florida and came across it, but it seemed a fitting image for control methods. Fencing. So not going to talk about fencing too much. Certainly hog fencing exists. It gets very, very expensive to cover more than a few acres. Aerial gunning, that is something that's definitely employed by large producers down in Florida, especially. Usually not something that the average person is going to get into. Helicopters are very, very expensive. Toxicants. So we have gone back and forth with toxicants. And there was talk even last year about registering warfarin based, so the blood thinner that is also used as rat poison for pigs. The biggest issue, though, is creating a bait dispensing or toxicant dispensing device that non-target wildlife can't access. So raccoons are an issue. If you make the door heavy enough, raccoons shouldn't be able to get in. But in Northeast Alabama, we got bears. Southwest Alabama, we got bears. So pretty much anything that a hog can get into, a bear can get into. The population of bears in Northeast Alabama is expanding. Southwest, they're not doing so well. But we certainly don't want to unintentionally be killing bears. Shooting, we'll talk about that more. And then trapping. Trapping is the most effective way that we can deal with our pig problems. So whole sounder removal. So pigs run in family groups. They can be quite large, over 30 in some cases. But whole sounder removal is one of the best options. Shooting is great. Pigs are very smart. They're smarter than your dog. So shooting can make them very, very shy, and it can make it difficult, especially to eliminate the last few pigs that are around. Whole sounders or whole sounder removal is the way to go because you trap them all or trap most at once, and then your issue is done until more pigs show up. So one of the more popular devices is called the Jaeger Pro. So you take bull panel, create that corral, and then you've got a gate that communicates with the game camera. So the game camera is going to send you pictures. You're going to see what's inside. Once you're satisfied with what's inside, you're going to drop the gate. And really the best way to go about this, you're going to bait for multiple nights. You can use fresh corn. You can use fermented corn. Fresh corn is usually fine, especially if the pigs are coming to it. But bait for multiple nights because you're going to want to see who's coming. I mean, pigs come in all sorts of colors. So you should get a good idea over the course of a few nights. Okay, well, I've got this many pigs that night. I've got fewer pigs, but some of them look different. So I know that I've got even more pigs than the first night. And then it really is real time. So that game camera will be taking pictures when there's movement in that trap. So wait until you've got as many pigs as possible and then drop that gate. What didn't exist, so I finished working with hogs around 2019. What didn't exist back then was a trap like this. So this is called the pig brig. Some of y'all may be familiar with it, but is it a passive catch trap? So it really is just heavy duty netting. It's going to be lifted. You're going to bait. The pigs are going to get comfortable. Then you move it into that position. The pigs, using their rooting behavior, wanting to dig with their snout and get under things, they're going to get in there. But because it's staked down further inside, I said they're smart, but they're not that smart. So they're going to go to the edge of the trap and try to get out, and they can't. So some really good trapping options there. But again, regarding toxicants, there was discussion last year about registering kaput in Alabama. Those conversations have stalled. So if any of y'all know Dr. Mark Smith, who's my senior counterpart, he works with pigs a lot more these days than I do. Was just talking to him and he said, probably not anytime soon that kaput will get registered in the state. All right, a different species. I like talking about this for a few reasons. But groundhogs, they are rodent. They're a large species of ground squirrel. They go by a whole lot of different names, and in places, they can cause significant losses to things like beans, leafy vegetables, peas, carrots, cabbage. They can climb well, so even fruit trees, or they can girdle the tree. They sometimes act defensively. Growing up, I had a dog that would fight all the groundhogs, and they're big enough that she had some close calls. But the reason why I want to discuss it and bring it up in this talk is because they are expanding their range. So here's a map from a few decades ago. Really, the northern third of the state is shown as where they occur. Um, they're over more than half the state now. So I've even gotten calls. Somebody said, we've got nutria in Opelika. And I was like, well, I live in Opelika. I feel like I would have heard about that. And I was like, well, was it close to water? And they're like, no. And I said, well, could it be a groundhog? They said, well, I didn't even think about that. But yeah, groundhogs are expanding their range south. It'll be interesting to see how far south they get. But for this species, exclusion or removal are the best options. Shooting is is a good way to go. So they are a game species. You can't possess one alive, but there's no bag limit. There's no closed season. As far as fencing, so woven wire or heavy um, poultry wire. This is going to be taller than for a rabbit, so at least 3 foot tall. And because groundhogs do dig so well, it should be buried. It doesn't have to be buried far, about 2 inches, but then there needs to be an apron. So much like the pigs can't figure out how to can't figure out how to get out of the pig brig, the groundhog's going to go up and dig down right at the fence. With that 18-inch apron, they're not going to be able to figure it out. But because they do climb well, you're going to need that overhang as well. A hot wire, just a single hot wire, will help too. All right, voles. So voles are not mice. Voles are not moles. Voles are their own thing. They're a type of rodent. And they can cause some pretty significant damage depending on the crop. So root vegetables and uh, and fruit trees for different reasons. So they'll go after the root vegetables, they'll gnaw on them, and they'll just eat them straight. As far as the fruit trees, though, they have a habit of girdling the tree. So especially when it comes to fruit trees, but also for gardens or for root vegetables in general, just trying to remove as much leaf litter or ground cover as possible. The 18 inches does apply to trees, but voles are tiny. Everything loves to eat voles. So they need that leaf litter and ground cover to feel secure and to move about. So removing that is a really good habitat modification technique. But again, they aren't mice, but they're about the size of mice. So really good way of lethal control with these guys is a snap trap. Using peanut butter and oats or using apple. Those are some good ways to help eliminate your vole problem. All right, need to pick up the pace just a little bit. Raccoons cause all kinds of problems for people, not just agricultural. They get into attics, they go after poultry, they do a whole lot of things. As far as damage to agricultural products, that they will go after. They like melons. They really, really, really like sweet corn though. Um, so there's actually a technique using filament tape that can reduce raccoon depredation on sweet corn. But let's talk about some of the ways to manage raccoons. So exclusion, because they climb so well, really an electric fence is the way to go for them if possible. Uh, Capsaicin repellents will work, even coyote urine. They're not that difficult to trap. I've tried coyote trapping before and I've mostly caught raccoons. But as far as lethal removal, so with shooting, there's no closed season, there's no bag limit on private land, and you can trap them year round. So a foothold trap would be the best way to go. Using a live trap, sure, that's easy to set up. It doesn't take any expertise whatsoever. You open it up, you put the bait in, which could be something like they really like marshmallows. But then just know with that live trap, it's not actually a live trap because you can't take that raccoon anywhere off your property and release it. All right, so just a very brief overview, legal status of the mammals. So the rabbits are split. Some are considered game, some are non-game. There is that permit exemption, so you can kill them out of season if they are causing damage. Deer, on the other hand, if they're causing damage outside of hunting season, you cannot legally remove them without a permit. Wild pigs, it's a game species, but there's no closed season. Uh, Groundhog, game, there's no permit exemption, but the season doesn't close, so that's not an issue. Voles, non-game, so they're not protected. None of the species in the state are protected by the state as a special concern. And then raccoon, they're a game, or they're a game species. Permanent exception, they are a fur bearer. But let's talk about birds for these last couple minutes. So why can birds be difficult to control? So unlike pigs or mammals in general, if your neighbor a few miles away or all your neighbors a few miles away haven't had a pig problem, pigs aren't going to magically appear on your land unless somebody moves them there. Birds, on the other hand, they can fly. They can show up literally anywhere. They are intelligent, and again, same with mammals. We use that neophobia or fear of new things to scare them away. And they receive a wide variety of protections. Like I said earlier in this talk, they're the most heavily regulated group of wildlife there is, at least in the United States. So as far as damage to agricultural products, some of the biggest issues are going to come from these four groups of birds: crows, blackbirds, starlings, and grackles. All right, problem birds. So here are the problem birds I just mentioned, but you can't just shoot them. Some of them you can. So I think that between the gun image and the peace sign image, we can get through this. So crows, it is legal to shoot crows. There's no closed season. Grackles, you cannot legally shoot them. You cannot legally cause any permanent harm to a grackle. And it's the same with a red-winged blackbird. So American crows, they are native. You can still shoot them. The state does allow that. European starlings, they're an invasive species, so you can remove them by shooting. All right, and this is all because of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I'm not going to get into the depth I get in this. I devote a full lecture to this in the class I teach, but So really, what the act states is that all migratory birds, so this excludes things like turkey and quail, which the states get to manage themselves, but all migratory birds are protected by this act. Now, some are going to be game species, waterfowl, for example. But if you are a duck hunter, you'll notice that the state does not release the seasons right away. They need to wait for the federal government to dictate when the seasons are going to occur. But the grackle, the blackbird, those are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so you can't harm them. We talked about that already. So pigeons, they are a non-native species. I'm not going to tell the racing pigeon story, but I get a lot of racing pigeon calls. The long and short of it is that they all have AU on their band, even though it has nothing to do with Auburn University. But as far as non-lethal techniques, so if we're having a grackle problem or if we're having a blackbird problem, um, five basic categories, very similar to the mammals. So habitat modification, exclusion, visual deterrence, auditory deterrence, chemical repellents. There was a great review of these both non-lethal and lethal control tools for this is discussing specifically invasive birds, but it applies, at least the non-lethal techniques apply to things like the bird or the blackbird and the grackle. There's my friend Jane over in Hawaii with some, obviously they use lethal techniques here. That's an invasive rose-ringed parakeet. So birds, because they are so smart, and we are working off this concept of neophobia or fear of new things, using a variety of techniques can avoid them to getting habituated to an area. So oftentimes you're going to need to use multiple techniques. So these first we'll talk about visual deterrence. So things like lasers, like drones. There are even trained dogs that are specifically used to scare birds away. Um, very briefly, birds they don't like spinning shiny things. They don't like lights like lasers. So those things can be deployed. If you go to the wildlife damage shops online, you can find lasers that will cover a whole field if that becomes an issue. Um, and then as far as auditory deterrence, the go-tos are pyrotechnics. So things like bird bangers or screamer shells, those are fired from something that looks like a flare gun. Um, but there are other auditory deterrents as well. A little bit higher test is the propane cannon that you see in the upper right. So that's going to emit a very loud boom. Um, Ultrasonic deterrents, those ultrasonic deterrents, they're marketed for everything from mice to cockroaches to birds. By and large, they do not work. Birds just can't hear ultrasonic sounds, so don't think about using one of those. There's something called a sonic net that exists for bird control. It does produce a sound that's about 80 decibels and it masks the bird sounds. This isn't something that can be used in residential areas, but for many of y'all's uses, it might be just fine. As far as repellents, so there's methylene. Um, the practicality of using it is going to depend very, very much on what you are growing. But essentially, it's this grape-based compound. We use it for human consumption to add grape flavor to food. But for birds, it's not directly comparable to us eating something very, very, very hot, but similar enough. And that's available in two forms. There's a liquid form and there's an aerosol form. What I haven't discussed, so there is bird netting that exists. So that would work on the exclusion principle, just keeping them away, and that's particularly useful for fruits, or particularly for fruits that are growing on trees or bushes. But with that, I'm right around where I need to stop, and I have also gotten to my last slide. So I'm happy to take any questions. Again, this wasn't meant to be a comprehensive overview because, I aside from that human wildlife or from the wildlife conservation law course I teach, I also teach a whole human wildlife conflicts course. which delves into this in a lot more detail. So that's a whole semester's worth of content. So all that said, if you've got questions that you don't want to ask right now, please do feel free to reach out to me either by phone or by email. But thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you, Dr. Anderson. I don't see any questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions, and we got just a few minutes. So, on the trapping,
Sure.
you have to put your name and phone number on the trout,
Yes,
or
if it
address, or just the phone number and the name, or what?
it should be just that's something that I'm gonna need to confirm for you.
Okay.
It should just be your name definitely needs to go on it, and I believe it's your phone number, but you might also need the address. Yeah.
Okay. And then if it's in your front yard or backyard, I can see if it's way down in the woods, but is that a big deal if it's by your house? It still has to be on there, I'm guessing.
It still
Okay.
needs to be on there. Still needs to be on there. I got a call just, it was earlier this week, or it was actually over the weekend. Somebody was very concerned because their neighbor was trapping right on the property line. They were still, that neighbor was still on the neighbor's property, but they were just concerned about the legality of it. And, it's like, well, it's on their property. But yeah, you never know. A cat or a dog could wander over, and it's your property. So, if it gets caught, that's on the owner of that cat or dog. But still, having that information on there is important.
Okay. And then you talked about the um vole, but like the mole, the vole, and the shrew.
Yeah, so mole and vole sound very similar. They are nothing alike. The reason I didn't discuss moles, so moles aren't ever going after your crops. Moles, they are spending almost their entire life underground. They cause problems because they're digging around looking for earthworms and mole crickets and things like that. But any damage that they cause is incidental as they're digging because they don't eat vegetables at all. And they are mostly an issue for backyards because it's more of an aesthetic problem than anything. And the techniques to get rid of them are very, very different than you would use for voles. Shrews shouldn't cause you any problem at all. They're the size of mice or even smaller. Again, they're eating things like insects and got a super high metabolism. So, if one gets trapped, it's going to die very quickly. But yeah, they could occasionally get inside a house, but shrews and moles, as long as the moles aren't digging through the crops too much, both those species are going to be good for the farm because they are eating the pests.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have, and I don't see any in the chat. I know you have another appointment. Okay. What can
Oh.
I use to a snake repellent to repel
Yeah,
snakes?
yeah. So, I obviously didn't discuss snakes because all snakes are carnivores, so they're not going after veggies either. Unfortunately, there is no snake repellent that actually works. Some people will try to convince you otherwise, but there's no science-based information that shows that it works. So the best recommendations, if this is for a backyard or something, keep the grass short, keep things off the ground. So people like me who study snakes, we throw out sheets of aluminum, we throw out sheets of plywood and things like that in an effort to attract snakes. So do the opposite. Keep the ground tidy. Snakes do get attracted to bird feeders because snakes do like to eat birds. So at least keep the seed off the ground if you can, because not only are birds going to be attracted to that, but mice are as well, and snakes love to eat mice. So that those are a few recommendations. Just keep things in perspective. We've got about 55 species of snakes in the state. Only 6 of those are venomous. And a venomous snake bite, it is a medical emergency, but the chance of actually dying from a snake bite is close to zero. I know they're scary.
Well, Dr. Anderson, we appreciate you today. Appreciate you talking to us, and I learned a lot. And thank you very much for being with us. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody for attending.
All right. Dr. Anderson's got to go to another meeting in a few minutes, but we've got Dr. Prasad here today. He's going to speak with us about nutrient management. And this is where, if you're vegetable farming, this gets in your pocketbook. So we need to learn how to use those nutrients correctly if we're going to spend the money. And we'll just go ahead on into this talk. And Dr. Prasad, if you can you share your screen? There you go. I see it. It's might not be in the view. We can see your next slide. So there you go. That looks good to me. And Dr. Rishi Prasad, he's a specialist at Auburn, and I really appreciate him talking to us today about nutrient management, because this really, it affects our pocketbook. So thank you so much for talking with us, and I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Perfect. Thank you, Chip. I really appreciate the opportunity here today. And thank you for watching this webinar. As Chip mentioned, the goal of this presentation is truly to talk about soil fertility. And I'm going to touch base some of the concepts of soil fertility, but also I'm going to talk about how to read a soil test report. So let's get started. Before we talk about soil test and all, first I would like to provide this information that when you're growing plants, they're like humans, they need 17 essential nutrients to complete their life cycle. Now, these nutrients are classified into 3 different categories. The first is called as basic, and the basic nutrients are primarily the ones that are derived from the soil or from the water or from the air. And you don't have to spend anything on these basic nutrients. Plants derive it by their own, and they are primarily carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The next list in the category is called as macronutrients. And as the name suggests, macro means greater. So those nutrients that are required in larger quantities, they are called as macronutrients. Whereas those nutrients that are required by plants in smaller quantities, they are called as micronutrients. So under macronutrients, you have nitrogen, we have phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, okay? Because these nutrients are needed in a much higher quantity. We are talking in terms of pounds, and not just 1 or 2 pounds, but probably 50 to 100 to 200 pounds per acre application rate. Whereas micronutrients are required in a very small quantity. You don't need to put too much, because if you put too much, it just causes problems rather than solves problems. So they're always required in quantities such as less than a pound per acre or 1 pound per acre, something like that, just to make this distinction very clearly between macro and micronutrients. Now, of course, where will all these nutrients come? So we are growing crops in soil. So most of the nutrients come from soil. And we always think about, like, can we just make a guess and apply nutrients? Is that a good idea? And I would say probably not. There is always this famous quotation that don't guess, but test your soil. Because when you test the soil, you will know that what nutrients are present and which nutrient might be a limiting factor for your for attaining a maximum yield. I mean, think about this barrel, right? Of course, if you fill this barrel, the point or the slot where you have this opening, the height of that determines where the water leakage will start or up to what point you can fill the barrel, right? It's the same concept applies to crop nutrition. If you have one nutrient in deficit, that's the nutrient that is going to determine the yield. I mean, the same thing, like if the lowest slit can tell you how much water can you fill, right, in this barrel. The same philosophy applies to for the crop production. So that's why I always say people that don't guess and just apply fertilizers blindly. It's always a good idea to test your soil and get an estimate of nutrients and get the recommendations as well of how much you need to apply in order to hit the maximum yield. Now, the other question that comes often is, what is a soil test measure? I mean, what are we measuring, right? Soil is very complex, right? It is made up of organic matter, clay particles, a lot of bacteria, fungi, and microbes. So a soil test typically measures the nutrient that is present in the solution, the soil solution, and also the nutrient that is present on the clay particles. So the ones that are present in the clay particles, they are called as exchangeable nutrients. Not all of that nutrient can get into the soil solution pretty quickly, but some of them can be exchanged in the soil solution through several principles of chemistry. And then also the roots can sometimes also get access to those nutrients that are present in the exchangeable sites. All right, now let's talk about soil testing. The first step to get a good soil test report is to first collect a representative soil samples. And for most crops, we recommend collecting soil samples from the top 6-inch. But if you are not able to go that deep, and say, for example, you're collecting samples from only top 2-inch, you must report that to the soil testing lab that the depth of the soil was 2-inch or 3-inch. But typically, most of our recommendations are based on the 0 to 6-inch, and hence the effort should be made to collect soil samples up to 6-inch depth. So whenever you collect a soil sample, the question comes in that should we just walk in a field and collect one sample and then say like that sample represents the entire field? And the answer is probably not. And I'll explain this from an example. Let's say, I mean, this is a field, and we collected soil samples at several locations. And I'd like to mention here is that the green represents the area which is very low in nutrient, and in this case, it's the phosphorus, whereas the red circle represents the nutrient that is in very high concentration. And when you pull out soil samples from this red circle, and when you send to a soil testing lab, it's gonna never ask you to apply any more fertilizer because it's reading pretty high. And the point I'm trying to make is here, what if, say, for example, you on a day you were feeling lazy and you just accidentally went into this red area and collected soil samples and sent to a soil testing lab, and the soil testing lab recommends that, hey, you don't need any fertilizer because it's testing pretty high. Guess what? The rest of your field, it does need a significant amount of fertilizer. And if you are basing your fertilizer applications just based on one location or one spot, the chances of under applying or over applying is extremely high. So You know your field, you know which are the productive areas, which are the high productive versus low productive areas, and you should always collect soil samples individually and test them individually. This way we'll know that how much nutrients you need in a high productive zone versus how much you need in a low productive area. Now, the other question that we come across very often is, what is the best time to collect soil samples? And the answer is it depends. But whatever you do, make sure that you are collecting soil samples at the same time of year. Typically, most of the producers, they collect soil samples in the fall season after they harvest the crop. And sometimes they do take samples in early spring as well. But make sure that if you are doing soil sampling, it should be consistent with the timeline. You should not be mixing and matching fall and spring, because if you do that, you will get two different types of soil test report and two different recommendations as well. Now, what happens, to the soil that you pull out and when you send to a soil testing lab? What the soil testing lab does is they extract these nutrients. And in the state of Alabama, we use two different kinds of nutrient. We use Melic 1 for all of our non-calcareous soils, whereas we use Lancaster for blackland prairie soils. So once the soil is extracted using either Melic 1 or Lancaster, depending upon the soil type, that supernatant gets analyzed in ICP or at the appropriate instrument, and then the soil test lab reports phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and they also report the soil pH. So whenever you send a soil sample to a soil testing lab, especially if you're sending it to Auburn, this is a soil test report that typically you are more familiar with, or this is what you get. It tells us, the area from where the soil was collected. You also provided the information on the kind of crop that you grow. So in this case, like this soil test was pulled from one of our stations, and the crop was corn. So you see, like in tier 1, corn was the main crop, whereas in tier 59, cotton was the main crop. And then the soil testing lab kind of determines or specify the soil group. We have 4 soil groups in the state: group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. So depending upon where that soil was pulled from, the soil testing lab will assign it different groups. All right, but the main thing that you need to look at in your soil test report is the pH. The first report is pH, and after that, they provide information on phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So these are the 4 nutrients that the soil testing lab reports on. And you also look at, the units. Typically, they report in pounds per acre, right? And they also assign a letter, like a letter M in this case, M45, H100. So when you see a letter like M or L or H, and I'm going to explain this in my coming slides, what it means is that this particular element was put into a bucket which says medium. It's a medium categorization for the phosphorus when the phosphorus extraction or phosphorus value was 45. The same thing applies for potassium. If the value was 54, it was put in a medium category. For magnesium, if the value was 100, it was put in a high category, and so on and so forth. So this is the soil test result that you get. You get pH, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And then the next group is the recommendation. And this is what the soil testing recommends you to apply. The first column under the recommendation is limestone, and limestone is the recommendation on limestone is primarily provided to correct the pH of the soil. So right now, in this case, the pH is 6.4, and you will see that the recommendation for limestone is 0. And the reason is because of any pH between 6 to 7, we assume that the most of the nutrients will be available, and for that pH range, there is no limestone recommendation. But if, say, for example, in this case, the pH would have been like less than 4 or 5, you will see a recommendation here for the limestone. All right, the next one is nitrogen, right? For nitrogen, these are the amount that you need to apply to obtain the maximum yield. Say, for example, in this case, 120 pounds per acre, right? The next one is phosphorus. Here they are recommending that in order to achieve the maximum yield, you need 40 pounds per acre of P2O5. And the last column tells you how much potash that you need to apply. All right, now I was talking about the pH, and I'd like to mention here that pH is such an important part of this entire soil fertility program. If your pH is not correct, meaning if it's too acidic or too basic, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium you apply, the plant is not going to respond to these added fertilizers. That is why pH is the #1 criteria that people should look into in their soil report and then determine whether they need a lime to fix the pH or not. This is a classical chart that we typically use that tells us the availability of the nutrients in regards to pH. You see that every single chart, let's say the top one is for nitrogen. You see there are 4 colors. The red tells like it is not available or it is available in a very small amount. Yellow is kind of like, yeah, it may be, or it is available, but in a very smaller amount. And the green is like, yeah, I mean, that nutrient is available to the maximum capacity. So you will see here, like, say, for example, for nitrogen, the optimum pH range falls all the way from 5.5 to somewhere between 7 and 7.5. But if your pH range is below 5.5, there will be less availability of nitrogen to the plant roots. Similarly, phosphorus has a much narrower range, and that range is between 6.5 to 7.5. Once your pH drops below 6.5, the availability of phosphorus starts dropping or declining. And then once you hit pH 5 and less than half, that phosphorus is not available to the plant. So this is a very classical soil pH and nutrient availability chart. And on the right side, you will see that how the micronutrient availability changes with the pH. And you will see here that for micronutrients such as iron, manganese, copper, zinc, and aluminum, most of it's available at a acidic pH, but once your pH starts increasing or starts going towards 6.5 and 7, their availability starts decreasing. For calcium and magnesium, as the pH goes up, their availability starts increasing. Similarly, for nitrogen, sulfur, and potassium, for phosphorus, you'll see that, as I mentioned earlier, that most of the phosphorus is available between the range of 5.5 to 6.5. And then for molybdenum also, as the pH increases, it increases and then it plateaus. So think about, all these relationship and like why it is so important to lime your soils, especially when your pH is in acidic range. And I wanted to show you an example, like what happens when your pH is 4.5 versus when you have an optimum pH. And this is figure that is a courtesy of Dr. Audrey Gamble, and this is a picture taken from our colors rotation. It's one of the oldest fertility experiment, and you can clearly see the role of pH. When you don't fix your pH, this is what your crop will look like, with a very poor growth habit, versus when your pH is 6.5. The crop looks much healthier, greener, and you will hit or achieve the maximum yield potential. Now let's talk about some of the pH, nutrient deficiencies related to pH. Iron chlorosis is one of the issues, especially when your pH is 8.5, because under such a high pH, there is a less availability, or not, I will not say less availability, but probably there's a deficiency of iron in the plants. The plants cannot take iron, and you will see all these veins are really green in color, and the rest area is yellow. So when you see this pattern, that tells us that there is iron chlorosis or iron deficiency. The next figure is for phosphorus deficiency. And as I said, like once the pH drops below 5.5, there is a limited availability of phosphorus, and the plant will start turning like purple in color. The leaves will become purple, or it will appear like extremely dark green. And in that case, we have a phosphorus deficiency situation. Now, for potassium, it's a blotchy in nature, especially you'll see most of them are towards the edge of the leaves, and they will progress inwards. And that's where you will tell that that's a potassium deficiency symptom. For nitrogen deficiency, the leaves are gonna look yellow, but the key is you have to look at the older leaves, meaning the leaves that are at the bottom, not the leaves on the top. So when the leaves at the bottom are like yellowish in color, that tells us that there is a nitrogen deficiency. But if the leaves on the top, the young leaves, if you see that they are yellowing, that tells us that there is a sulfur deficiency. So you need to be careful on distinguishing a deficiency symptom due to nitrogen versus a deficiency symptom due to sulfur. Now, how do we correct the soil pH? And to raise the soil pH, we typically apply agricultural limestones. There are two common fertilizers, or not fertilizers, but liming agents, and they're called as calcitic liming agent, which is your lime, and the second one is dolomitic liming agent, which also supplies magnesium in it. Now, coming back to this soil test report, I talked about, the soil test and the soil test level, but the next part is recommendation. And you may wonder, like, how does soil testing lab gives us the recommendation of phosphorus or potassium or nitrogen, right? All right, so I will talk mostly from a phosphorus and potassium standpoint, because nitrogen recommendations are primarily given based on the crop and yield responses. But from a phosphorus and potassium standpoint, whenever we have a soil test, we classify our soil test into 6 different buckets, depending upon the value of the soil test. And these buckets are called as very low, low, medium, high, very high, and extremely high. And I would like to show you this or explain this graph. This is a way to interpret a soil test report. As I mentioned earlier, that when a soil test, in this case, MELIC 1, when you get a value less than 50 pounds per acre, you'll see that either the soil will fall under a very low, low, or medium category. And when it's above 50 pounds per acre, they will be characterized under high or very high or extremely high. This is a classical relationship between a soil test extractable phosphorus and the relative yield. And you can see here that when you apply fertilizers up till this between 0 to 50, you will see an increase in yield. But once you hit this 50 pounds per acre mark, anything that you add on the top of it, I mean, it's not going to give you any yield response, right? And that's how we kind of recommend our P and similarly K using this classical relationship between the extractable P and K and relative yield. And these comes from research through trials in the field, and not just 1 year of trial, but several years of field trials and experiments. Now, you also need to understand that, the soil test, it doesn't measure the total amount of nutrients. What it does is basically it helps us, it's an index, okay? And it helps us to predict the fertilizer requirement of the crop. And as I mentioned earlier, that when we test the soil, we classify the soil test into this category. And depending upon which category your soil falls in, we provide the recommendation. And the way we interpret our soil test for a very low category is, like, if, say, for example, your soil test fall under a very low category, and if you do not apply any P, then, or any P or K, then the chances that you will get less than 50% of the potential yield is extremely high. But if your soil falls under a low category, then you will receive somewhere between 50 to 75% of the potential yield. If it falls under a medium category, you will get 75 to 100% of the potential yield. And if it falls under a high, typically we say that your P and K is adequate and you do not need to apply any additional P and K. And if it's very high or extremely high, that means that it is 2 times the adequate level or 5 times the adequate level. So typically, most of our soil fertility recommendations stop right at this medium category. I mean, we do apply at medium category, but it stops if your soil test high. So if you see that the recommendation says 0 pounds per acre, like let's say here in this case, if, say, for example, in this case, if P was 0, it means that your soil already had enough phosphorus or enough potassium, and you don't need any additional P and K in this situation. All right, now let's talk about the right rate. I mean, how much fertilizer do we need to apply when it comes to crop yield? So this is a classical relationship between nutrient supply and crop yield, and it's called as law of diminishing returns. What it means is, in the initial phase, like if, say, for example, if you don't apply any fertilizer, you will still see a yield, right? But once you hit that point, anything that you add on the top of it is gonna increase the yield in an incremental fashion, and until you hit the maximum yield, right? But once you hit the maximum yield, any fertilizer that you add on the top of it, you're not going to get any yield increment, but maybe you can start seeing even a decline in yield. So there are two concepts. One is like where the rate that is determined for the maximum yield, and the second one is based on the economic optimum. Economic optimum rate is where the price of fertilizer and yield is taken into consideration, and the optimum level is where is at the intersection of the economic the crop yield and the fertilizer rate. Now next is the timing. What is the right time of fertilizer application? I'd like to provide you this this example with this graph. This is a typical nutrient uptake response curve of a plant. And what you see here is initially the plant does not need a lot of nutrient because it's it's still growing. But once it kind of hits a maximum vegetative phase, And once it starts entering the reproductive phase, that's where the requirement of nutrient of the plant, it increases linearly. I mean, you can look at the slope of this curve is very steep, and that's where the maximum amount of nutrient is required by the plant. So whenever we are applying fertilizer, we always need to think about a split application. You don't need to put everything here in the upfront, because if you do that, the plant is not taking that much of nutrient because their requirements is very low. And if you put too much, then those nutrients are susceptible to loss risks for the environment, to runoff or leaching or denitrification. And that's why we always recommend that you should be applying fertilizer as a split application, meaning put less in the front, and then once you see that the crop has reached to a certain vegetative stage, then you put most of your fertilizer at that time, because if you do that, most of that nutrient will be available to the plant, and plant is going to respond in a much better fashion. And the other advantage is that those nutrients will stay in the soil, which the crops can take, and not susceptible to losses. Now let's talk about the source of nutrients, right? We have talked about soil test and how to interpret the soil test, but the next question is, what are the sources of nutrients that we should be looking for? And the number one source that we typically use is fertilizer, right? There are some other sources as well. You can also apply manure, and I'm gonna provide a little bit more information about manure later. But if, say, for example, you have a very good soil organic matter, that also supplies a significant amount of nutrients to your crops. And that's why, it should also be considered a source of nutrient for crops. Now let's look into the fertilizer first. And before I talk about fertilizer, I must provide you this information that when you go and buy a fertilizer bag in the store, this fertilizer bag has three numbers: 20, 10, and 20. The first number refers to the nitrogen content of the fertilizer. The second number represents the P2O5, or the phosphorus content of the fertilizer. And the third number refers to the potassium content, which is typically represented as K2O, right? So say, for example, you purchased 100 kilograms of this fertilizer, which was labeled as 20, 10, and 20. So a 100 kilogram or 100-pound fertilizer bag will contain 20 kilograms of nitrogen, and will contain 20 kilograms of nitrogen, 20 kilograms, 10 kilograms of P2O5, and then 20 kilograms of K2O. And the remaining is filler. So I think there's a it's misspelled here, so there's a mistake. So I'm really sorry about that, but we'll correct it. But that's how you read a fertilizer level. Now let's talk about some of the common nitrogen fertilizers. The number one nitrogen fertilizer that most growers use is urea. And as you can see, urea is 45% nitrogen, and that's why it is labeled as 4500. The other important source of nitrogen is ammonium sulfate, and it is labeled as 210024. The number 24 in the end is for sulfur. So that represents the amount of sulfur that is present in ammonium sulfate. And the third important source is ammonium nitrate. I mean, it's difficult to find ammonium nitrate these days, but it's also a very good source of nitrogen. And in this case, ammonium nitrate is labeled as 3400, meaning you have 34 kilograms of nitrogen if you buy 100 kilograms of ammonium nitrate fertilizer bag. Now let's talk about some of the phosphorus fertilizers. The most commonly used phosphorus fertilizers are DAP, and MAP. So DAP stands for diammonium phosphate, and it is labeled as 18460, whereas MAP is labeled as 11490. Now, when you are using DAP, you also need to understand that DAP contains nitrogen as well. So 18 means it has 18% nitrogen, 46% P2O5. For MAP, you have 11% nitrogen and 49% P2O5. So when you are using DAP or MAP, make sure that you account for the nitrogen that is present in this fertilizer, and then you can subtract that amount and apply the rest from other source. Primarily, if you're using urea, then you can calculate how much you need to apply based on, if you're using DAP and it has 18% of nitrogen, or MAP, which has 11% nitrogen. All right, now let's talk about some of the common fertilizers for potassium. The number one source is the potassium chloride, which is also called as potash. And you can see that the fertilizer grade of potash is 0060, meaning when you buy 100 kilogram bags or 100 pounds bag, 60 pound is potassium, or in potassium. The next important source of potassium is potassium sulfate. And again, as it has sulfur in it, so when you buy a bag, a 100-pound bag of potassium sulfate, 53 pounds would be potassium, and then it will also contain 17 pounds of sulfur. Another important good source, or typically this fertilizer is preferred by a lot of row crop growers. It's called as K-Mag, and as the name suggests, it contains potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. So you're providing 3 nutrients at one time, and the fertilizer grade is 0, 0, 20, 22. So the 20 is the potassium, and the 22 is sulfur. All right, so we have discussed about the fertilizers as a source of nutrients. Now let's talk about manure as a source of nutrient. Most commonly, manure that is used in Alabama is either broader litter or the hen layer, or hen caged, or layers. And when you do an analysis, and again, I always recommend that if you're using manure, please make sure that you collect a sample and then get it tested and know how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium is present in the manure before you apply it. Typically, broader litter has a higher nutrient value compared to the hen or eggs. I mean, the chickens that lay eggs, they are called as layers. And the nutrient value of layer manure is much lower, almost 50% less than a broader litter. But manure is considered a complete fertilizer. What it means is when you're applying manure, you're not only applying these major macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, but they also contains micronutrients, and that's why a manure is considered as a complete fertilizer. Now, I was emphasizing that it's so important to test the manure is because, I mean, look at this figure here, the picture. You have like 4 or 5 different kinds of manure, and there's no way that just by looking at this manure you can tell like how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium is present in this manure. And that's why I always say, like, don't trust what you see. It's important to test it. Just by looking salt and sugar, it is difficult to differentiate. So why not we test manure and get the actual nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium content, and then we base our applications of nutrients or manure based on the nutrient content of the manure. Now, an important thing that I would like to mention is, the considerations for using manure in vegetable crops. As you all know, that manure contains a lot of microbes, especially viruses, bacteria. Some of them are highly pathogenic as well. So it is not advised to use a raw manure in vegetable crops. Because if you do that, you will contaminate the crop. And if somebody eats that vegetable, either in the raw form, that person may get sick. So we always recommend that if you are planning to use manure for vegetable production, you must compost it first to make sure that it has no pathogens, because when you compost it, the heat that is generated during the composting process, it kills most of the pathogenic microbes that is present in the manure. And when you do that, your manure is safe to apply. Also, if you are applying manure, or if you are in a situation where you have a lot of availability for manure and you are just applying manure every single year, you need to be thinking about the soil phosphorus first, and then decide whether your soil phosphorus is reading high or extremely high. If that's the case, then you should not be using manure as a source of nutrient for your vegetable crops, because the problem of repeated application of manure in any system, whether it's crops, whether it's vegetables, or whether it's fruits, if you keep applying manure, manure has phosphorus in a very high amount compared to nitrogen, and that creates a situation where phosphorus starts accumulating in the soil due to repeated application of manure year after year after year. And that's why you need to be a little bit careful that if you are using manure as a source, don't over apply it, or you should think about the phosphorus levels and then think whether it is the right source of nutrient to apply or not. Now, manure is also considered a slow release source of nutrient. What it means is it's not going to act like a fertilizer. If you buy a commercial fertilizer from a store, when you apply it and when there is enough water in the soil, all of that nutrients is immediately available to the crop. Whereas in manure, that manure has to first break down, and because of that breakdown, there's a process called as mineralization, and because of this, the nutrients are slowly released from the manure. And again, there is a difference in the pattern of nutrient release from manure. Like, say for example, nitrogen, around 30% of nitrogen in manure is released within the first 10-15 days after manure application, and then the remaining nitrogen is released in a very slow fashion, as if you are spoon feeding the plant. Phosphorus is the same, almost 50 to 60% of phosphorus that is present in manure is water soluble. And when you apply manure, that amount of phosphorus gets dissolved in the soil solution and supplies phosphorus to the plant. From a potassium perspective, almost 80 to 90% of potassium that is present in manure is immediately available to the crops. So when you apply manure and when it rains, or if you're applying irrigation water, 80 to 90% potassium that is present in manure should be available to the crops on a very quick basis. And then my last take-home point, especially for manure application in vegetable crops, is excessive or repeated use of manure can cause environmental issues, and you need to be careful on choosing the right source for your operation. So I guess with that, I'll open the floor for questions if they have any questions for me.